right,
Thank you.
perfect. Basically, you're gonna see starting soon because it's the screen we're having to the streaming. Whenever it starts, we're gonna see the full event.
We're good. No, no, I mean, we tested the connection. Yes. What is going on? What are you doing there with that? I don't even know if it's afternoon already, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pablo Vieira. I am the Global Director of the NDC Partnership, and I have the pleasure and the honor of being moderating today's event hosted by IFAD and Egypt's Ministry of International Cooperation. The Resilient Credit Initiative was launched to address the urgent need for innovative approaches to funding for adaptation activities and climate resilient development. Unlike mitigations, which has standardized metrics and many years of work in the form, for example, of tons of CO2 equivalent, measuring and monetizing adaptation and resilience benefits lacks consensus across academics, across sectors, and geographies. A working group from Duke University, the Ministry of International Cooperation of Egypt, and IFAD have evaluated various metrics to measure resilience. This exercise assesses each metric's fit for purpose to support resilient credit implementation. And we have discussed that in detail at an advisory committee meeting earlier this year, where the NDC Partnership is also a part of. So in today's session, the panelists will take you through how a value may be attached to resilient benefits or improved resilience. To be appealing to investors, resilient credits should possess particular attributions. They should be relevant. They should be simple, cost-effective to measure and monetize, and provide a clear representation of how improvement in resilience contribute positively to the livelihoods of the most vulnerable. The ecosystems they work in and the economies that they contribute to are also fundamental elements of this exercise. The support unit of the NDC Partnership has been a part of the advisory committee for this work. Nearly every single one of the more than 90 countries who have requested support through the NDC Partnership have requested specific support to access climate finance. So this is a very relevant topic that we're discussing today. And innovative solutions like the ones we will hear about today are critical for countries to realize their climate objectives. And we're very happy to also be supporting the analytical work we will hearing more about today. We have 4 speakers joining us today. It is a pleasure to introduce our speakers. First, we have Dr. Rania Al-Mashad, Egypt's Minister of International Cooperation. She has been in this position since December 2019 and was previously Minister of Tourism. Prior to that, the minister was an advisor to the chief economist of the IMF in Washington, D.C. We also have Dr. Joe Perry, Associate Vice President of Strategy and Knowledge Department at IFAD. She leads the organization's strategy work in key areas targeting agriculture, climate, gender, nutrition, youth, and social inclusion. Joe has worked previously at the Green Climate Fund, 3E, UNEP, the World Bank, and UNDP. She is also an adjunct associate professor at Columbia University in New York. We have also Jay Collins, Vice Chairman of Banking, Capital Markets, and Advisory at Citigroup, with over 30 years of leadership experience at the intersection of international finance and global policy. And he has joined us. Maybe this is the 3rd time you come to an event at the NDC Partnership Pavilion, so we very much appreciate you being back. And we have also Professor Marc Joland joining us online, holding primary appointments in the Stanford School of Public Policy and the Duke Global Health Institute at Duke University, and secondary affiliations with the Nichols School of the Environment and the Pratt School of Engineering. He currently co-leads the James E. Rogers Energy Access Project at Duke. So we will start today's session with opening remarks from Minister Rania and from Dr. Joe Perry, followed by a panel discussion. So, Minister, if I could please invite you up to the podium to get us started. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and to everybody who's here, and to our partners, Joe, who has played a fundamental role with the team in IFAD and the Ministry of International Cooperation, Jay Collins, Citibank, with his team, who have also brought in the financial sector and the private sector perspective. Of course, Duke University, who has been doing a lot of the analytics behind it, the NDC partnership, for showing how all of this can work to push forward countries' commitments to their NDCs. We also met at COP27 last year at Sharm el-Sheikh, where we had this idea. It was just a concept note, and we were very keen that we would be able to push this agenda forward. It promotes the optimal utilization of resources, innovation, new technologies, but also make sure that this concept of just financing is taken into account. There's, of course, the importance of increasing the efficiency of the current scheme of international development cooperation. We need to put forward innovative financing tools. This has been discussed. I think if we take a look at this COP, 2 very important concepts come out. Country platforms are being re-emphasized, that everything has to be country-led. There have to be linkages between the different sectors, and then deepening different types of markets, carbon markets, and today when we talk about resilience credits, this is another way to push forward on the adaptation side, because adaptation finance is the least when we take a look at the stock take and we look at the different financial instruments that go in that direction. IFAD is a leading institution that helps when it comes to the adaptation sector. And I remember when we were preparing for COP27, Joe would come to my office and convince me that there is a profit for private investments in the adaptation sector. And we actually represented that in the Sharm el-Sheikh Guidebook for Just Financing, where IFAD were partners, Citibank were partners with us as well. So we try to push this concept that adaptation can actually draw in financial returns for those who invest, but with resilience credits also to the farmers that are going to be encouraged to be part of a monetization of these projects. I want to thank everybody, and I look forward to the discussion and also to the presentation, which will shed light more on the topic. We have an advisory board, and many of the representatives here are in that board, but we also have CPI for the data. We have leading NGOs who work in the space of adaptation and also work in the space with small farmers. Again, this is a step in our journey. And what we want to do in the period ahead is to quantify this more and actually create an example that could hopefully be scaled. And finally, IFAD is a lead partner with Egypt in the food pillar of the nexus of water, food, and energy. We take that with great pride and happiness, and we've accomplished a great deal on different projects, and we look forward to seeing how resilience credits can actually be, to some extent, implemented, if not in maybe a small project, so that we can scale forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pablo, for having us here, and thank you very much to Minister Rania and all of our partners that have stood with us and have expressed interest and excitement about this idea. The genesis of this essentially started from thinking about 4 or 5 different parts of the overall climate resilience agenda that we feel currently remains relatively ignored. And this is one of the things that we are also doing with the NDC partnership, and there will be a white paper that we'll be releasing actually on Sunday, talking about 4 different aspects of trying to bring in finance, but also making sure that it has the right attributes. Because it's not just the quantity of finance that we're looking for, it's also the quality of finance. And so in this journey, other than, of course, the government of Egypt and Minister Rania's support and leadership, Pablo's engagement, but also Jay's engagement from City, as well as Duke University, we're really privileged to be thinking about this with a group of stakeholders that are committed to this. So a couple of things. First, when we are thinking about the overall resilience agenda, we are thinking about how can we aggregate resources from different partners that have different risk appetites. And that's essentially building a platform. But then thinking about the blending of these resources requires some amount of work. I mean, we are all talking about blended finance, but it's also important to recognize that blended finance by itself is not the easiest thing in the world to put together. It requires a lot of painstaking work to think about different risk appetites, different sources of financing, different end games for a diverse range of financiers in this space. And then the third question is really building those bankable projects, because we know that we want to have an entire portfolio that reflect exactly these different risk appetites, but also opportunities. And the last one, and Minister Rania spoke about this, is really the idea of benefit sharing. So what we want to do with resilience credits is this idea that, yes, the farmers or the smallholder farmers that are most instrumental in investing in resilience in the agriculture space, because they are, and we've done evidence reviews of this, they're far more likely to be diverse, far more likely to use agroecological, agrobiodiverse methods to also invest in land on one side, but they are also the ones. Food systems are also one of the greatest contributors with respect to greenhouse gas emissions. So if we want to use this both as a challenge but also as an opportunity, we've got to start to think about how we can make sure that the benefits of investing in this also percolate to the small-scale producers and farmers. And this is why we are thinking and have brought together a diverse set of stakeholders in this space to think about financing, to think about benefit sharing, to think about bankability, and to think about building this overall platform so that we can bring all of our stakeholders together. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Joe, for opening. I would now like to invite you to come up and we can then get the panel started. If the 3 of you could please join us, and I'll also join you here. Well, we have the extra seat for Mark. Perfect. So the idea of this conversation is to understand a little bit more the nature of the resilient credits, the valuation process, and understand this very innovative idea, how it would work, and maybe also compare it a little bit with what carbon credits are. So can I please start with you, Minister? Maybe tell us a little bit about the value proposition for the resilience investment and explain the parallel between carbon credits and resilient credits, and the insight into the importance of having a tool like this, maybe also from the point of view of a developing country and resilience.
Thank you very much. I think I will give three points. There's a presentation, but I want to leave more time for Duke, for Joe, and for City. But 3 points are very important. Number one, food security is very, very important for countries that are developing, particularly in Africa. So this is key. Number two, the idea of carbon credits or resilience credits, the pricing becomes very, very important. So what we're trying to do here is to see how we can actually create a value and monetize this for the projects that we're thinking about. And number three is to, make sure that we maximize also the monetary value for the smallholders of farming. So those are maybe the three objectives from a policy point of view that make this very appealing. But the details are what matter, and the details here include the financial sector, include those who are doing the projects for the pricing, and this is what we want, hopefully, to be able to square so that we can move forward and show examples that could be replicated.
Thank you very much, and you're, I think, linking all the critical parts. No, there needs to be strong technical work, but we need to demonstrate implementability for something that is very difficult, like adaptation and resilience. So that this is extremely exciting. So I'll come to you now, Joe. I think that you're going to explain in a little bit more detail what resilient measurement methods are and how IFAD is working on this and how this is relevant. So please.
Okay, so I'm not going to look at slides, so don't worry about them. What I want to do, and I'm going to try this. I know I'm going to mutilate your wall, but your team has been wonderful in trying to help me think about this, right? So one of the key challenges in resilience is really, in adaptation, is really recognizing that adaptation is a many splendid thing. You can get to adaptation and the overall impact on resilience through many pathways, right? You can do, for smallholder farmers, you can do no-till farming, you can do agrobiodiversity, you can do agroecology, you can invest in irrigation, you can come up with ways to reduce food waste and loss. So if you've got, take my slides off, don't worry about the slides. Mark, if you, yeah, thanks. So if you recognize that, yes, it is many splendid, but you can get to adaptation and resilience through different pathways, then you've got to think about, instead of fragmenting it and saying, oh, we'll give you one credit if you invest in irrigation and another credit if you invest in reducing food waste and loss, instead really thinking about it completely in an agnostic way and just thinking about resilience, then the challenge becomes that of measuring it, right? So what did we do? So a few years ago, actually quite a few years ago, IFAD started to think about resilience measurement in its own portfolio. We started with, a small sample of projects, which was about 5 to 7. Then we expanded it, and our portfolio is now, at the time that we tested it, $7.1 billion. We tried it on a sample of $1.1 billion. So that's the project, and that was a sample size representative. For all of you who are statisticians, this should be important. For everyone else, forget what I said. But the important thing is then thinking, for that $1.1 billion portfolio, can we understand resilience? And again, IFAD works in 80 countries, and we wanted to understand with one number whether we were making a difference to resilience or not. So think about Lesotho, think about Mozambique, think about India, think about China, Brazil. Every country, every context has different interventions that you're going to essentially put in for resilience improvement. So we did two things. Clearly, we put in data methodologies to essentially collect data in the areas that we were coming in with financing on, recognizing that you can get to resilience through different context-specific interventions. But we also set up counterfactuals. Counterfactuals, that is comparison sites. So what would have happened to those sites or to those people had IFAD not come in with the resilience funding? Yeah? And so we wanted to be able to say what is additional as a consequence of IFAD and its partners coming together for funding over and above what would have happened anyway. And that's the additionality in resilience that we essentially started to measure. That's the first thing. The second thing we recognized is this idea that, yes, you can get to it through different pathways. So we said, okay, we're going to have household level surveys that look at the ability of a household to either recover, stay the same, or be worse off after a shock. Yeah? And the shock is essentially, we have a taxonomy of more than 25 shocks that can occur: livestock price, macroeconomic, conflict, etc. Sorry, I'm just going to take a second. Not a second, 2 minutes. And then so for every shock, we took a sample of representative households in the areas that we are working in and asked them, okay, did that shock occur and did you recover or not, right? For each one of those shocks, for each household. So then at the household level, we then have a measure called the ability to recover for every household that we are collecting data for. That household sample at the level of the site is representative for the site. We did the same measurement in the areas that we are not intervening in, right? To understand, well, what was happening in those sites where IFAD is not coming with resilience funding. The difference between those two aggregate numbers was essentially giving us the additional impact as a consequence of IFAD funding. But this is important to note. We weren't showing a positive increase in every site that we were coming in on, right? So we're looking at 25 countries, 25 sites, and I can show you what's called the aggregate, what's called the forest plot. And sorry, this is why I put up the chart. There are sites like, you know, Lesotho and Mozambique, where we actually showed that it was better for IFAD not to come in on resilience than leave the sites to their own devices. So we did not do very well. But there were many other sites where we did extremely well and where we are very confident that those differences did occur and it was positive. If you pool all of that data, you get what is called the aggregate effect size. The reason I'm telling you this is that when we computed the aggregate effect size for all of the 25 sites that are representative for our population, we found, thankfully, that at the portfolio level, we were making a positive, measurable difference that we were confident of at the 95% level of confidence. Right? So we were able to improve resilience by 13% for our entire portfolio of $7.1 billion, and we were 95% confident that that's happening. That's the aggregate effect size that we are essentially saying, and it's important. This is at the level of the entire portfolio, which is essentially taking away the one challenge of adaptation, which is that you're getting to adaptation and resilience through different kinds of activities. And instead of fragmenting it every time, let's be agnostic of the pathway, but measure what's happening at the impact level. And the impact is the improvement in the average ability to respond or recover compared to the counterfactual site. And that we were able to show is positive. So that's the idea that we are taking forward and then saying, if we can do this and the data is available, people can come, replicate it so that we are not sort of washing it. You can look at the data, etc. Then the idea is, can we then, for every percentage increase in average resilience, generate a credit for the investors who are coming in? Because there is both a private benefit as well as a public benefit of investing in resilience. Private is clearly your smallholder farmer and the investors becoming better off. But there's a public benefit as well because you're ensuring that your food system in the local and in the global sense of the word is becoming far more secure. That's exactly one of the reasons that we are here. In the context of the climate crisis, conflict crisis, as well as prices that get affected because of these unexpected shocks, you want to stabilize your overall food system. And so there is a public good benefit of that as well. And we want to ensure that that credit then also is measurable enough so that investors can take credit, trade it, and then part of the revenue can go to the smallholder farmer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I think it's a very compelling story, and with the numbers to prove it. So thank you for that explanation, and I'll invite now Mark, who's joining us virtually, to present the methodology that is used to valuing then these resilient credits based on what was proven already by IFAD. Mark, please.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Okay, great. And I will share my screen now. Can you see my screen?
Yes. It's shared.
Okay,
I don't know if we can
perfect.
not. Okay. Yeah. No. Perfect.
Okay, so thanks so much for joining this group today. My name is Mark Juland. I'm here representing the Duke team. That's one of the partners supporting this work. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to dig deeper into our work and our ideas so far. So I'm going to cover three main challenges with implementing the idea of a resilience credit. The first is determining what the right measure of reward for resilience should be, something that Joe touched on briefly. The second is working out how to actually value that. And then the third is to create some kind of resilience credit institution around those concepts. And I'll spend most of my time on the first two issues, trying to minimize duplication with what's already been said. So let's discuss the first challenge first, which is measuring resilience. So the first step of this is actually agreeing on a definition. And we won't debate the definitions today. Minister Rania has already discussed the UN definition, which for our purposes today provides a good starting point. But there are a few things that should be unpacked about operationalizing this definition. And I'll just highlight a few of those points. First is the fact that the relevant scale spans from individual to community levels, because to some extent, my own resilience depends on and benefits from the resilience of those around me. Resilience is also about much more than climate. It's also resilience against other shocks, and that resilience surely improves resilience across the board. Or in some cases, resilience against one shock may actually reduce resilience against other types of shocks. It's maladaptation of some sort. Finally, there's no real consensus on how resilience should actually be measured. And many indicators or proxies have been proposed in the scientific literature as well as practitioner literatures. And in a few slides, I'll discuss how we have begun to think about the pros and cons of these different measures as they apply to a resilience credit idea. To begin this thought process, we next have to consider what a resilience measure has to try to capture. Here, it's vital to understand that enhanced resilience can do any of four things in the context of a shock. It can reduce the magnitude of the disruption that occurs. It can slow the effects of that disruption or lengthen resistance to it. It can shorten the duration of the disruption during which well-being has been harmed. And finally, it can accelerate recovery from the disruption. Capturing all of these dynamics is quite challenging and implies collecting information over time following a disruption, perhaps using survey or remote sensing techniques. And given that, for creation of a credit, we need some standard measure of resilience that's sufficient to capture those dynamics. This requires the use of a reliable and a generalizable method that could instill confidence in investors, financing institutions, donors, and other participants in a market. In other words, it can't be overly complex or sector specific. It can't depend on the context that it's being applied to. And this requires comparability, concerns about comparability, ensuring comparability. The standardized measure must, however, capture whether the target populations have in fact become more resilient. Only then can the measure be turned into something that investors could invest in and then trade. So let me close this measurement piece with a few examples that help demonstrate our thinking about these various issues. Many metrics for resilience have been proposed by international organizations, academics, and the private sector. In working to refine the idea of a resilience credit, our team reviewed several of the most prominent such frameworks and measures. A common argument in these prior efforts is that resilience is a complex and multifaceted concept. The slide you see here focuses on some of the most widely discussed metrics that have actually been applied in real field studies and program evaluations. In the interest of time, I'll limit my comments to how we characterize the appropriateness of these potential measures for the task at hand. The first aspect to consider is the measure sufficiently beneficiary or target population oriented? That is, does it measure impacts at the right level? Several aggregate country level measures that have been proposed are not ideal for this. They gloss over variation in resilience across individuals and communities. Resilience is also by definition about individuals' own perceived capacity to withstand shocks. But higher resilience should be manifest in objective measures of well-being, for example, higher income or greater productivity. And that type of checking against objective measures provides cross-validation. Third, in the context of an intervention that aims to increase resilience, because shocks don't always occur, and because many other contemporaneous factors other than an intervention may affect resilience as well, the measures have to be deployed across space and time among populations that are exposed and not exposed to the intervention to really understand if resilience has been enhanced. This was a point raised by Joe. These aspects relate to 4 basic criteria that we believe should be applied to determine whether a metric is appropriate. Is it intuitive or valid as a measure of resilience? Second, is it simple enough and parsimonious, not requiring too many questions to assess? 3, can it be captured cost effectively? And 4, is it sufficiently generalizable? That is, having the same structure and definition across populations, sectors, and intervention types, but also customizable to capture context-specific differences or to better understand how a resilience intervention works when that's needed. And so coming back to the slides, there are clear trade-offs across these criteria, and no measure will be best in all of the dimensions. On this slide, we compare IFAD's ability to recover this ATR indicator that Joe talked about to 2 somewhat different examples from the prior slide. And that helps demonstrate that ATR measure has a number of advantages. For example, it is intuitive, it's parsimonious, it's general, and it's beneficiary focused. It's intuitive because it asks the target respondents and comparison individuals directly about their recovery from various shocks. So that's really measuring resilience. Assessment of the impacts of an intervention hinges on comparing these groups who experienced the intervention and who did not to understand the impacts on resilience. And shocks can be observed over time, such that the ATR can be measured accordingly over time to capture more complex dynamics. It's also parsimonious. It's based on a limited set of questions. It's general because the questions asked do not change. They're always the same and applied the same way across different sites. It has, in fact, been managed, collected cost effectively to measure resilience impacts at a large portfolio level. So as Joe noted, that analysis showed a 14% improvement overall on average in ability to recover. That's the type of portfolio impact that can help begin to form the basis for supporting more investment in other similar interventions. Used on its own, of course, ATR has drawbacks, all of these do, because there are trade-offs across the advantages, but it has these key advantages.
Mark,
and if we contrast,
if I could ask you to help us close in the next couple of minutes, would be great. Thank you.
Okay.
Sorry.
And if we contrast that to other measures shown here, they have important shortcomings in terms of scalability and in terms of cost effectiveness. Okay, so let me talk briefly about this valuation piece then. Valuation is very challenging because determining what improved resilience actually means in terms of economic benefits depends on who you're going to ask, but we're sort of interested in the overall social value. So in thinking about this, one has to consider these various parties who might value resilience. And we're trying to think about this in our work from two main perspectives. The first is with smallholder farmers. So translating that 13% ATR benefit into what it actually means in terms of economic well-being. So how does it increase income, as well as how does it increase non-pecuniary benefits? For example, reduced mortality risk. What's the value of that? Or spillovers through community income. And this relies on use of applied benefit cost analysis and other valuation methods. The second main perspective is to consider the investor side of this. Here we can try to see what resources investors are willing to put on the table to support resilience investments of different types. And in pilots, we'll be sort of testing this, seeing where the demand is from the investor side for making these improvements. And we can sort of vary different aspects of the investment, such as the risk versus return and the time horizon for that investment. Okay, so finally, I'll skip through the piloting in the interest of time, but let's talk just briefly about this third challenge, which is creating an institution. So here the idea is to start with, some such sort of facility that would bring capital, blended capital at sort of lower costs to farmers to make resilience investments. And then you could sort of find out what those benefits are and how farmers are able to pay back those investments, establishing the basis for making these loans and credits available. But then in a scaled up phase, you take away that sort of preferential capital and you move towards the private sector. And this is where the farmers now have found a way to sort of monetize their resilience through this improved income. And they can then sell these credits through an intermediary, some kind of aggregator, to investors who are interested in buying up those credits. And that facilitates the flow of capital into the sector and creates this virtuous cycle of continued investment. So in order to recap here just briefly, a lot of challenges here, but defining resilience, conceptualizing those benefits, standardizing measurement, finding a way to value and monetize the resilience, and then creating this structure is sort of the journey that we're on. And then we can imagine this sort of resilience credit marketplace where investment and trading could occur. And so now I'll cede the floor to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you very much, Mark, for that presentation. And of course, you mentioned something very important, which is the participation of the private sector in this whole equation. And I'm happy then to bring in Jay Collins to tell us a little bit about how resilient credits can attract and benefit the private sector. Jay, please.
Great, thank you. So first, I'd say we've had a number of these conversations about how to take this forward, and for those of you that have been part of the carbon credit discussions here, they're much more advanced in terms of thoughts. A lot of things are being announced where we're having panels like this where there are commitments being made, and I would just say today is a brainstorming session really around the realm of the possible. So I'd like to give you some thoughts in that regard. I think when we, I'm not really going to address what I think was well covered, which is defining the metrics around additionality and pricing the additionality. But move to the next step, which is how do you think about the value of a credit? And just like in any market, the value of a credit requires a buyer to price it, right? So then you have to think, okay, so who's buying this? And let's just break this down of where, kind of easiest to more complex over time. I mean, first of all, if you can put in additionality and kind of broad-based adaptation terms, where there's no cash flow that is direct from a number of these projects, but when I do cost-benefit analysis, there's a huge multiplier on the benefit that comes out of it. Think, water resiliency, or think adaptation infrastructure. A dollar of investment can have 15, 20, 30 times kind of benefits to the common, and that's part of the problem here. Is we have a tragedy of common problems of who's going to pay. So, but the easiest is to say whether it's loss and damage level, global kind of community, whether it's a country or an IFAD, that there are official organizations, philanthropic organizations, aid organizations that want to fund and pay for a behavior, an investment, because we can demonstrate that there's a metric around it and there's value in it, and in doing so, there's some reward for that behavior through which you use the credit. And I think as a first step, if you were to say to let's just say a co-op of farmers, that this type of behavior has an outcome that we need to happen, and a credit can be created such that there is a process through which you can continue to benefit, and funding can be made available because of that. There's another concept that comes again. I think we should all be looking at the flaws and systemic challenges that we're facing right now in the carbon space, and drawing those analogies, because there's so much here that screams potential, but you have to think through, well, we haven't even solved it for carbon. But one of these is, why in the voluntary carbon credit world do we still have so much problem? We have integrity issues, right? We have valuation issues around what the price should be. But we also have within the corporate space the potential that, first of all, that you could pay for the carbon credit for CSR reasons, right? Your corporate social responsibility. I have committed to net zero pathway. I've made a commitment to that pathway, and that may not yet be codified in asset liability, legal disclosure, price terms. But so think now in the resilient credit world that I may be a global Fortune 100 that wants to see, from my CSR perspective, I want to see adaptation move. I want to see resilience move. And I'm not going to get in the business a codified benefit, but I'm prepared to put funding from the private sector alongside the IFADs of the world, alongside the government of Egypt, alongside a philanthropic organization, to put that to work. And I want to see some credit for that is valued in terms of how I can explain to my contribution. And so when Citi thinks about ourselves and our clients of how do we price the contribution, the mechanics around that help. But there's a lot more potential than that. There is the potential to look at what's happening in the adaptation space, for example, and saying, we're going to have to throw multiples of more money at the food and water crisis and the SLR or natural disaster world if we don't advance the funds now. And not to get too technical, but there's concepts in insurance of value at risk, right? So, if I have a certain amount of value at risk in natural disaster propositions, which the insurance companies can kind of map out, and if I want to reduce that value at risk, I'm prepared to pay money into this. And so there is a conceptual, still to be defined in this space, need to say, okay, if I were to invest in food and water resilience, if I were to invest in natural disaster resilience, and I have a massive amount of value at risk, and $1 can eliminate $20 to $50 of that risk, then how do I, as a policy matter, create a financial instrument that will induce that investment today that is wise, to ensure that happens? And if I can put processes around this, and again, just think what we're trying to do with the carbon credits, that has integrity, that creates a market, and induces behavior, that makes sense. And then the last concept is one that's very much in the room. In fact, I had 3 meetings this morning. I can't even believe it, because I normally don't have the same type of meeting back to back like this, but on what's happening in the Article 6 negotiations and discussions now. But we're linking tax to the carbon market. So the best way to think about that will link to resilience credits for a second is, so Singapore is going to give tax benefits to offset tax obligations of corporates when they show up with a carbon credit, right? And this will then mean that instead of a do good, do well proposition in the CSR world, that actually I can say to myself, okay, wait a minute, if I'm going to give a tax benefit for some carbon credit, now I start to get closer to assets and liabilities on balance sheets. I start to have real financial implications, and I drive drivers. And a lot of the Scandinavians, a lot of the officials that I'm meeting with here are thinking that way. So again, in preparing for this, Joe and Minister, one of the things I was thinking of is if we can have even a limited number of governments that were to start to say, this type of corporate behavior is so critical to our countries. And by the way, maybe they're developing, but also developed, to pilot the idea that the large ag players that have precision ag, let's say water resilience type tools, that were they to be induced into this, that there would be an offset in terms of their taxes. I can create, and by the way, it doesn't have to be the totality of what we've calculated in the Duke analysis to be the totality of that benefit, but even small tax benefits against some methodology of value contribution, you could begin to show mechanisms to induce that behavior. And it's much harder than in mitigation, because remember that we don't have the cash flows direct. We may have the common cash flows and benefits, or we may avoid a future cost, kind of the tragedy of the horizon, but I've got to codify that nonetheless, even in that adaptation and resilience space, to figure out what I'm prepared to reward for that. And that's really all kind of concepts that just has to be, and I want to applaud everyone and that's been working on this to kind of continue to try and take this closer and closer to practice. So I hope that's somewhat helpful.
Thank you very much, and yes, I think these are the practical matters that need to be looked into to make sure that this goes beyond just a methodology, so thank you. I don't know if there's burning questions, but I think that we have an opportunity for our audience to maybe ask one, maximum two questions. So anyone interested to come in? Okay.
Thank you very much for this really fascinating proposal. Building on the tax relief issue, I wanted to ask the minister: is it possible that if this market gets set up, it would reduce social protection expenditures, and would that be a motivation for tax relief?
I think the motivations are plenty, and to minimize it just to the social spending is not giving it its value. If this works, you're doing more than one thing. You're making the corporates more efficient, the cooperatives around farmers more efficient. You're creating more incentives to avoid building on land, for example, which sometimes provides more money than agriculture. So there's so many benefits from a policy point of view that would convince the Minister of Finance to provide this. Also, if we are able to show how this, and we're in the NDC Partnership Pavilion, how these are contributing to the country's NDCs, I think that in itself is very much similar to what Jay said, linking it to what the carbon credit provides for the government in terms of its NDC contribution. I think this would be the bigger policy question.
May I make one comment, Minister? Years ago, probably a decade ago, I presented to the U.S. Congress on the problem that they were having with the amount of budget money is massive to put out fires as opposed to forest fire prevention. Now, in this case, we had massive amount of money going already outlaid into the future of the forest fires, and what happened is it crowded out every year more any money that could be spent on everyone every year was responding to it. So to your point is there's no reason why we couldn't go where we're already seeing the worst of failure to respond to resilience. Let's just take the 300-some billion of natural disaster economic damage and translate that into fiscal costs in a given country. If you could show over time what that's costing, so that then you could say, to your point, is there's budgetary monies here that would not be spent if you give this credit to induce this behavior over here. I think that thought process could be very, very powerful.
Yes, very much. Please.
And that could help the quantification. I mean, it's in another way from a government point of view.
Well, I think that it's very clear that the potential benefits are huge. There's a lot of work to do. So we'll go for one more question before we then look at next steps.
Yeah, my question is related to the work of Mark. If there's a strong focus on indicators related to recovery, are we missing an opportunity to think more about transformational climate adaptation? And I'm thinking about systems where they're on the edge, cultural systems on the edge of viability of ag capability.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think, the whole point about sort of wanting to think about investment and mobilizing investment is that opens the door to some of these transformational opportunities, which may, exactly be about building resilience. But for sure, if we don't know sort of what the interventions are that provide those transformational potentials, then those ideas need to be tested out, and they can be tested out through some kind of marketplace that rewards those investments when they work. And I think Joe wanted to add something.
Please, Joe.
Thank you. So it's a great question, but I think that the important thing is to recognize that because we are also looking at areas where you're not intervening, anything that is transformational should be picked up, right? But I think the important thing to recognize is what Mark is also saying. what makes it transformational? And it's not just coming in at the end and sort of doing the cheap talk and saying, oh yeah, this area is much better than my counterfactual area. It's actually figuring out what is making it transformational. And for that, you definitely need good monitoring data, satellite data, remote sensing data, etc., to figure out which pathway worked, what worked, for whom, why, how much, etc. And all of that is also part of our measurement framework. So I don't want to sort of assuage any concern that this is just sort of, coming in at the end and sort of saying, oh yeah, we're only going to look at impact. You need to understand the pathway as well, and that's what is, I think, important, but definitely requires much more work as well. And that's why we want to put this collaborative together, and we put this collaborative together. So great question, and also Ken's question. So Ken is from the Global Innovation Fund. But I think the important thing is recognizing what Jay said, that there is the value at risk, and using it to price it. We know that opportunity cost, essentially it's opportunity cost for most economists. What are you preventing if you are putting in resources into resilience, right? What are you preventing? And that's what we see in most insurance mechanisms as well. But this is important because insurance is recognizing that there are wide swaths of the world where they will not come in. The premium is just too high.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. And we're about done, so I would like to invite the Minister and Joe to maybe tell us a little bit about the next steps, and then we can close. Thank you.
Okay, so the next step is really that we want to be able to pilot this. We've got other than City Minister Rania, now yourselves, you're in for the long ride, Pablo. And we've got a few others who are really interested in also thinking with us. We've got Duke, we've got also the Global Center for Adaptation, really interested in trying to see as to how we can take it forward. We want to be able to pilot this idea. We piloted it with our own portfolio, obviously, but we also want to pilot it in other people's portfolios, and we know that we've got a couple of takers for piloting the idea, and then we want to be able to work with the likes of Minister Rania and Jay to try and see as to how we can price it. And that clearly, as Jay said as well, we're literally at a nascent stage. If you want to take the experience from the voluntary carbon market, we need investors to essentially say this is a global good that we are interested in thinking about, and bringing in investors for that side of the overall framework and platform too. Minister Rania?
No, I just want to say that, as Jay mentioned, we're still at a point where we are trying to quantify. Quantify is very, very important, so that the monetization of it makes sense on a policy level, on a private engagement level, and also the benefit for the farmers, or for the corporates, and so forth. So we wanted the message to get across. We wanted more people to brainstorm with us. We want to get some traction so that we can also, with the models that Duke University put and the metric that is very, very detailed. And if we go through each one of them, maybe we need a session for each of these, for each of the metrics separately, so that we can come out with something that everyone can digest and be able to react to.
Well, thank you very much. So I guess one of the things that we could do from this point is a save the date for coming back in a year to report progress, everything that we're going to be doing over the next year. So we don't know where we're going to have a COP, but wherever it is, we're going to be talking more about this. So I would like to invite everyone to thank our panelists for this impressive presentation, and we'll continue discussing. Thank you very much, everyone.